All right, does anyone have a question?
I'll start off with one. I've noticed that a disturbing sort of disbelief that there can be life on Mars among scientific people that I think endangers the ability to get funding and so forth. Here's an example. In July, here at the Space Museum had what they call Mars Day. And they had a full-size mock-up of the Curiosity and so forth, but they also had some meteorites from Mars that were known to have come from Mars. And I chatted with the Air and Space curator, and she described that there's some that are so incredibly pristine and special, they don't let them out. And then she pointed to one that she had, that she says, nobody cares about this one. Well, that one was of the same collection that was collected, I don't know, about 100 years ago or so, and that a NASA scientist early this year released some some electron microscope photos showing what looked like fossils of bacteria and so forth. And that sort of rubbed me the wrong way. It's like the way she was so dismissed, oh, we don't care about that. Is there enough people in the scientific community who totally dismiss the idea that there can be life, and that being an impediment?
I think you're talking about the difference between the weather and the climate. On an individual, person-by-person basis, it sounds like you ran across an unfortunate situation where somebody was being negative, had a bad day or something like that. That's the weather. The climate is totally different. I think there's broad consensus among Martians and non-Martians that it was a habitable environment by our definition of habitability, and that in the subsurface it may still be a habitable environment. We have no idea what the heat flow is, we have no idea what the state of water is, the organic concentration, et cetera, et cetera. There is, to me, an astoundingly broad level of optimism about the possibility of life on Mars in the past and even today, compared to when I got into this when 20 years ago, when there was an astounding amount of pessimism. So I think the picture is much more optimistic than was painted by that one person you talked about.
I'm glad to hear it.
And speaking as a non-Martian myself, science isn't about beliefs. So what one scientist says they believe or don't believe, at that point, you need to talk to scientists who are evidence-driven. And clearly, to answer a question of this magnitude, we have to have the evidence to prove or disprove it, and we cannot do that unless we actually have samples and we know their provenance and we know where they came from, so that we can draw appropriate conclusions from them. That's the scientific method.
Just one or two general observations and questions. There is a nascent DARPA program called the 100-Year Spaceship, which is being examined and actually funded or put out for funding in near term. But the concept of the 100-Year Spaceship, one, could be broadened, and two, wouldn't have to be 100 years at a shot. Maybe it could be a 10-year Mars ship. And if you really try to get around the apparent, actions of these Luddites in this building who are going to gut your program, maybe you want to go outside the school of Luddites and go to the people and find a way to do a 10-year Mars ship in the same sense that DARPA's thinking about a 100-year spaceship. Find a new funding vehicle, find a new way to draw in money and change law and change policy and get it together and go. Because the way I see it, there's going to be a terribly terrible doldrum coming on, and even in the best scenario, things are going to take a good big hit. This is a good time to change your vehicle, because the vehicle you're trying to save is going to take such a big hit that even if you save it, you may be in deep trouble. So my question is, why not tie all of this to STEM training, tie all of this to jobs, tie all of this to the prospect of getting a broader funding vehicle and say, yes, you know, we do see this hit. Let's change our thinking. Any of
I would just have to say the following. I mean, some of the latter points you made about STEM and so forth, I strongly agree with. But with respect to the 100-year starship, I'm all for people exercising their minds, but to be talking about 100-year starships at a time when the actual planetary exploration program is being gutted is selling sizzle without the steak. Okay? I'm all for sizzle when there's also a steak. And we got to make sure there's a steak and not just sizzle.
That's right.
You can always count on Bob from Singer. A couple of comments. You touched on a lot of things in your comment. Let me respond to one of those, which is the idea that something, some entity other than just the traditional government funding may be involved in space exploration. And I think what we've seen over the last 6 years or so is the emergence of entrepreneurs. Now, and I use Elon Musk as one example. I've known Elon for 13 years. I met him before he thought about doing SpaceX, when he just cashed out of PayPal's. And he's been a space fanatic for a long time. And he was willing early on to put his own funding in this. However, like any good Silicon Valley entrepreneur, there has to be a business case that closes. And so the business case that closes for him is now enshrined in what's called the COTS and the CCDAV programs. These are the things where they're trying to create a business ecosystem. Richard Branson thinks that he has a business ecosystem in suborbital tourism. I frankly agree with him. I think that's going to happen. But the exploration for science in deep space has no return on investment that I can find. So I think that's going to remain the province of government funding for the foreseeable future.
Just make sure that we say it has no return on investment in the short term. Over the long term, there are studies that show that there's very significant return on investment for things like the Apollo program, whatever. So disassociating the short-term return on investment, which is needed for business, from basic research, which is something that government can do, is a fundamental thing that people need to appreciate.
And just one more comment, something that really resonated with what you said, take it to the people. We were in a similar situation in the late 1970s, early 1980s, of going through this real drought of exploration, lack of leadership and vision, and that's when the Planetary Society was formed. That's when Carl Sagan, Bruce Murray, Lou Friedman got 100,000 people together to come into this building and the other one, and with a voice of, we need to do this, we support this. And you can argue about the effect that that really had, but getting the public involved is part of what we do at Planetary Society, Mars Society does as well as other organizations. So that's a great vehicle for getting that those voices that you want into this debate.
If I might respond.
All right.
What I'm asserting is that the model that the 100-year spaceship is trying to put forward, a non-governmental, non-commercial entity to organize, bring in money, and organize this research is perhaps not a bad model. I don't know who's going to win that. None of us do. I don't know what idea they're going to come up with. But if we're looking to think out of the box, we want something which is not necessarily tied to commercial, because the payback from Apollo was over 40 years. And maybe it was 20 to 1, maybe it was 10 to 1, but if it was even 5 to 1, it was pretty significant. So we want something that's a non-governmental organization, not necessarily private enterprise.
Okay.